Since first being deployed as a highly posable and highly articulated product in the boys' action figure market, G.I. Joe, a real American hero, became a powerhouse franchise and a force to be reckoned with amongst the growing 1980s toy industry. While competing for the attention of buyers each holiday season and simultaneously serving as year-round birthday gifts for the young male demographic, parent company Hasbro would need G.I. Joe to go toe-to-toe with other top-notch toy brands at the time that were being rolled out by rival companies such as Kenner as well as Mattel. With all of that said, this is the story of that original cast of 13 military heroes and the introduction of the Cobra enemy faction who would stand opposite to them during your playtime battlefield adventures and on the toy aisles. This is the history of G.I. Joe in the year of 1982. While many of us do look at 1982 as an introductory period for the 3 3/4-inch real American hero that would dominate the toy market for years to come, the inception of G.I. Joe came nearly a generation earlier when the 12-inch movable fighting man hit store shelves back in 1964.
Taking the form of an action soldier, action sailor, action pilot, and action marine, G.I. Joe saw many years of success before it would be forced to pivot its focus due to the widespread negative aura surrounding the military theme that resulted from the Vietnam War, not to mention the rising prices of oil needed to make the 12-inch plastic bodies.
The G.I. Joe marketing gimmick would wind up shifting to that of a roaming adventure team and eventual other non-military themes, which worked to extend the brand's lifespan for several more years. However, the subsequent rising production costs, declining sales, and shift in product focus to other more popular brands at the time resulted in the original G.I. Joe toy line folding by 1978. Also, with Star Wars widely popularizing the 3 3/4-inch action figure and playset scale, Hasbro would revive the G.I. Joe brand by 1982 in this same scale. They'd go with an articulated body construction comparable to their original larger scaled figures and an O-ring center point to hold the figures together, much like the Chips figures made by Mego Corporation a few years prior. And thus, from the ashes of the 12-inch movable fighting man, a real American hero was born.
G.I. Joe would also become the codename for an elite fighting unit, a daring, highly trained special mission force, rather than serving as a generic soldier as it did during its previous incarnation. And with the late introduction of an enemy team suggested by Marvel Comics, coupled with the brilliant artwork designed by Ron Rudat, all the elements were in place for a great narrative to reignite the success of what would become a legendary and timeless toy franchise.
Since 1982 was before the days of the eventual Sunday animated cartoon series, G.I. Joe, a real American hero's primary media would take the form of an ongoing comic book series instead, authored by legendary writer Larry Hama, and would span for 155 issues, reaching its end by 1994 before being picked up by IDW Publishing many years later. IDW would go on to employ Hama along the way to continue this particular storyline after its 155th issue. The tale of G.I. Joe after its inaugural year will be saved for another day, but in looking at that historic 1982 initial offering, there is still quite a bit to unpack. I'll point out immediately that this first year had the figures produced in a straight arm fashion, with only an elbow bend, while the swivel articulation joint was added when these same figures were produced for a second run in 1983. I'm aware that fans generally refer to the 1982 straight arm versions as version 1, whereas the same figures with the added swivel joint are known as version 1.5. For the purpose of this video, you will see a mix of those 1982 straight arm figures and 1983 swivel arm Joes, but with them being basically the same version of the character, I figured I'd state that as a disclaimer. All in all, that won't affect the narrative that we are trying to tell here.
As part of that narrative, you'll notice that the bulk of the initial wave of G.I. Joe figures from 1982 were offered up in a very traditional OD green military paint scheme, all with varying degrees of deco and detail. In the years since, the story has surfaced that all the deco was removed from one of the figures as a late-stage cost-cutting measure. This figure would be known as Snake Eyes. Nevertheless, in the years that would follow, the Despite being initially offered up as a singular color scheme figure to save money, Snake Eyes would become the closest thing G.I. Joe had to a heroic frontman. Being that strong silent type who could get the job done, Snake Eyes is an icon that has transcended pop culture status and has been offered in multiple versions in the subsequent decades following the initial release of A Real American Hero in 1982.
Snake Eyes' love interest in the comics would be the other heroic character not produced in the standard green military color, i.e. the counterintelligence, crossbow-wielding Scarlett. A strong female character, and among designer Ron Rudat's favorites, Scarlett would play a pivotal role not only in the comics, but also in the cartoon series that would debut the following year. The other single-carded good guys this year would consist of the G.I. Joe communications officer named Breaker, the semi-colorful laser rifle trooper called Flash, the M16 wielding infantryman aptly known as Grunt, a heavy machine gunner in rock and roll, the mortar firing soldier Short Fuse, a light green bazooka carrying triggerman known as Zap, and of course the fan favorite camo decked out Army Ranger they call Stalker. The remaining heroic characters would be sold along with military themed vehicles. Clutch would be sold with a timeless Vamp Jeep, which is an ever-present staple in G.I. Joe lore. Grand Slam would be sold alongside the HAL, or Heavy Artillery Laser. Steeler, who would feature prominently in the famous G.I. Joe cartoon two-parter called World Without End, was sold with the battery-powered Motorized Battle Tank, or MOBAT. As for the team leader, Hawk was sold alongside the Towable Mobile Missile System, or MMS. Serving as the original field commander during the epic Marvel Comics run, he was known as Colonel Hawk at the time before taking a more mentorship role when he'd be released as General Hawk in 1986. Other vehicles sold this year would include the rapid-firing motorcycle, or Ram, with its ultra-cool-looking Gatling gun mounted to one side. And of course, there was the Jet Mobile Propulsion Unit, or Jump Set, frequently used by characters such as Stalker in the comics, and the jetpack of which was also released with the mail-away figure known as Starduster 5 years later. Also comparable, but not the same as the HAL, is the Flak, or Field Light Attack Cannon, which was also available in this year, and as such, the small playsets became something of a staple for this toy line in the years that would follow.
At first glance, you'll notice this initial offering of figures and vehicles in 1982 largely sticks to traditional military color schemes, with a few exceptions. The more realistic vibe of this opening year of A Real American Hero made the original 13 something of a standout for the following 12 years of A Real American Hero's run, and it would only be in subsequent years that we'd see splashes of more vibrant colors, science fiction themes, various sub-teams, and flamboyant overall designs.
Now, while they officially gave us less options numerically in terms of unique figures, you could army build to your heart's desire with the forces of Cobra the Enemy. Armed with a Dragunov sniper rifle, the main Cobra the Enemy figure would eventually be known to fans as the Cobra Trooper or just the generic Cobra Blue Shirt Soldier. He's one of my favorite army building options, probably because of the figure appearing in large numbers across the various forms of G.I. Joe media. Naturally, he's led by a Cobra officer, similarly constructed with just enough differences to make him stand out, and this time carrying an AK-47 assault rifle. Last but not least is the Cobra leader with the screeching, high-pitched voice, Cobra Commander. This is the helmeted version, only available via mail-in offer when you collected 5 flag points on the backs of your figure cards or vehicle boxes. Like Snake Eyes, he'd go on to become something of an ongoing presence, released in a ton of different versions over the years. While he's generally found with the standard Cobra chest logo, early versions of the Commander would sport a slightly different logo, one with some details at the top of the logo that harken back to a certain famous Disney character. As such, this hard-to-find variant is known to collectors as Mickey Mouse Cobra Commander. This version would see itself available to collectors once again for a short period of time in something of a re-release or reissue format, assuming of course you ordered the HasLab Sky Striker during its 2021 availability period. The other figures were also not without certain variations. For example, Zap's bazooka came in different mold configurations, Short Fuse's mortar accessory had its various release styles as well, and the Cobra Soldier and Cobra Officer came with various different eye colors. All that, plus sometimes the helmets could be hard to tell apart in color, what with subtle different color variances upon initial release and potential sun fading over the decades, further skewing their colors even further. And before vehicles and playsets became a thing for Cobra, background settings for our villains this year were limited to just the Sears Missile Command headquarters. This was a set constructed entirely of cardboard for what I can only assume is due to limited budget, what with Hasbro also removing all of Snake Eyes' deco as mentioned previously being another example of cost-cutting measures. What's neat about the Missile Command is that it offered kids yet another way to get the single figures of Cobra Commander, Cobra Officer, and Cobra Enemy Trooper, as all three were packed in with this set. Note that mint or even good condition ones are difficult to find, what with the cardboard nature of this set and all. As such, nice examples are considered something of a holy grail for toy collectors, and as we all know, there'd be more than a few grail type pieces in the G.I. Joe toy line in the years that would follow. Finally, the 1982 toy line would also give us the official carrying display case, which I understand was already used as a backdrop for some of the photography in this video, but let's hone in on it a little bit anyway. This case is good for fitting a dozen figures, along with some file cards that we'd cut out from the backs of the card backs. Note that the inside of the case would have the name placards for the individually packaged figures, but not for the vehicle drivers.
For most toy lines, a release of 16 figures, 7 small vehicles or playsets, and 1 slightly larger cardboard playset would seem like a lot of product. But as we'd soon find out, G.I. Joe was just scratching the surface, as we'd go on to see significantly more product in the dozen or so years that would follow.
And we should also mention that in this same time, an independently developed yet very similar toy line was produced in Europe. That's right, 1982 would also see the release of G.I. Joe's overseas cousin, Action Force. In the same scale, with a similar military theme, Action Force would see a comparable number of figures, vehicles, a mail-away figure commander all its own, and interestingly enough, a cardboard-based playset as well in its opening year. Hey, what can I say? Great minds and great brands think alike, right? While Action Force built its foundation with an opening year by releasing downscaled figures featuring highly popular outfits from its predecessor Action Man line, we would eventually see Action Force branch off into its sub-team based concept that it became famous for, and this line would also selectively share both figure and vehicle tooling with the American-based G.I. Joe brand. Ultimately, for a real American hero, G.I. Joe's impact was felt worldwide, as even a Canadian collector like myself would be collecting the figures before the 1980s was over, and yet again as the 1990s got going. All in all, with a great opening lineup of toys, the foundation was set for years of success, albeit followed by inconsistent years of both middling ups and downs throughout the late 90s and 2000s, all to see a collector resurgence by the 2020s with the G.I. Joe classified line. Either way, it all began here in 1982. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters and channel members whose names can be found in the description section of this video. Visit patreon.com/toyconnections for some behind the scenes footage and other bonus content, or click the join button next to my channel name to unlock special custom badges and emojis for your use in any Toy Connections video or live stream. Further thanks goes out to my co-presenter Articulated Chad for his assistance in the development of this upload. You can find a link to his YouTube channel in the description as well. As a final note, I'd also like to express my gratitude to several friends and other online sources for their contribution in allowing me to use their personal collection imagery for this video. Their names are also in the description section below. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please click on some of my other content here. Subscribe if you already haven't, press that like button to spread this video to more viewers, and share it with your friends. Otherwise, yo Joe, and I'll see you again soon with some more of my favorite toys. Thanks again, and take care.